We know there's so much of a health impact related to stress and anxiety. And when I think about masking, that's what always I think about is like the level of stress that you have to experience to always be running this masking program in the background, of your brain.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the ADHD Social Playbook podcast. I am so excited today to bring to you two friends of mine, Emily Kircher-Morris and Amanda Morin. And I want to show you their book. Okay, so I have all my little tabbies on their book, and they have written a wonderful book. I love that it's neurodiversity-affirming schools because the word affirming is one of my favorite words. I think that everything should be neuroaffirming. You both put a lot about masking in this book. And as I was making the little tabbies, I was like, how come we talk about masking in a book about schools? And I'm being a little fresh, but I do want to know.
Well, it's not as sassy as you might think. So it's a great question, right? And I would start by saying one of the things is we expect kids to mask often in schools, right? Period. Like that's we are expecting them to show up and act a certain way that may be completely against their authentic selves, their neurodivergent selves. So it's something we have to talk about if we want to make sure we have neuroaffirming schools.
Well, and I think also, we talk about masking a lot in adults. I think a lot of people who are part of the neurodiversity community talk about this often because they can reflect on it. But when you think back on it, those are habits that they built from a very young age based on the messages that they were receiving from society. And so that pressure to conform, to fit in, to hide those parts of yourself that aren't acceptable or don't lead to good outcomes, whatever that might be socially or academically, whatever, it gets really ingrained from a very young age. And so when we think about being neurodiversity affirming and creating neurodiversity affirming environments in all spaces, that starts in school. That starts with educators recognizing what that looks like and then finding ways to allow kids to be their authentic selves. And not feel ashamed of those parts of themselves.
I like this discussion because I think that something that you and Amanda both just hit on is really important to say aloud, which is kids don't get a choice. As adults, I might work for someone who is Corilla DeVille, but I can ready my resume and I can say, guess what? I am not going to play your reindeer games anymore. You're going to make me behave a certain way. I'm not doing it. I'm readying my resume and I'm going out into the job market.
Right.
But kids don't even get to choose their teacher. They get no choice whatsoever.
I was just going to say, and then they're stuck there. Actually, it's funny. Amanda and I were talking with some folks just yesterday, and this conversation about getting kids ready for the real world. And this is something that always comes up. But just like what you're saying, like school is often not like the real world because there is so much more autonomy. And so if we're creating neurodiversity affirming environments at school level, it really does entail educators understanding how to provide options and opportunities for that autonomy so that they can manage all of those things without building this anxiety, without trying to hide their neurodivergent traits.
And also for teachers to recognize that they may not be seeing the true kid, right? And I think that that's an important thing. One of the reasons that this is in the book is because not all teachers know that masking exists, right? They see the behavior component, I say quotation behavior, right? They see behavior that they don't understand that may be related to a student really struggling to show up in a way that they are not able to show up in. That was too many ins, right? But teachers often don't know when a student isn't being their authentic self if they haven't given them an opportunity to be that self in their classroom.
No, I saw exactly why you did it. I was like, oh, I see these ladies are cutting. I love it, right? Amanda, I thought about that idea of agency. I really did. But I really love that we're talking about it because, I think that we were just talking about my dad and his many phrases. This one is not off color. Schools are often meant for the cheerleaders and the football players and the really popular and the really gifted student-wise. The kid who was going to get into Princeton no matter what. Like, you plop them anywhere they're getting in. And I think that schools often don't realize how much kids are suppressing and how much energy that takes. And I don't know, I don't want to get too personal if you don't want to, but the minute you said that, Amanda, I was like, I know exactly the facade that I put on as a kid. As a matter of fact, I don't think people picked up on my ADD because I was a nice little girl in a kilt. It was brutal, actually. This image is brutal. A kilt, braids. I had a sweater that said Caroline and bows in my hair. And I was in outer space the whole time. I don't think I heard a word they said. But facade-wise, I looked like they wanted me to look, right? And I presented without trouble, and I was spaced out the whole time. I don't know what they said, but they thought I was tuned in. They didn't think I was tuned out. And I think that whole thing is part of what you're talking about. And I don't know if either of you had a similar experience.
I definitely did. I definitely did. I think, when I tell people I had a tough time with school, they're really surprised to hear it because they didn't see that happen. But I will tell you, I don't remember anything from third and fourth grade specifically. I don't know what it is about third and fourth grade. I do know that when I work with students, those are the ages when it becomes harder and harder for them to actually mask. So I think there's probably something there about it. It was really hard for me. I don't remember it because I was so exhausted every day, at the end of every day, coming home, having to try to sort of be in this box of what was expected. I don't know how I know my times tables. Thank goodness for calculators, because that's the year you're supposed to learn them. But, I showed up in the way that I was expected to. I also had the braids, didn't have the kilt, didn't have the name sweater, but I had the
thank
braids
God
and the
you didn't have
bows.
the kilt. It was brutal. The kilt was brutal. The kilt was part of my bullying problem. Trust me, the kilt is not something I would recommend.
I think from a sensory perspective, they would have seen different behavior from me if I had to wear a kilt, just to be clear. But, but I didn't show up in a way that people would have expected. Oh, you're neurodivergent, or, so now when I talk about it, there are people I know from years and years and years ago who are like, are you kidding me? You were a great student. You were perfect. I never would have expected that. And I was like, you don't know what it was like on the inside, though. And to me, that's part of the reason we have to have these conversations, is because if you don't know what it's like on the inside, you need to understand a little bit more about what it's like on the inside for the students who are really, really trying to hold it together.
I would just say, for me personally, I was not good at masking, to the point that I was not only always getting in trouble, but I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was in 5th grade, which, as we know, yeah. And, isn't it so interesting? That's the reaction I get from women.
Just because we're also women. I mean, like, let's call it out there. Mm-hmm. We're women, and we're women of a certain, I will say I'm of a certain age, and I'm Gen X. And so there was, I knew boys who had ADHD. And my cousins were diagnosed who were boys, but none of the girl cousins were diagnosed until we were adults.
Yeah, I think I was diagnosed in like 1991, but my mom was a special ed teacher, and she was like, something else is going on here. And so she was a huge advocate, but also that's how much I was struggling. Like, there was like, it was so obvious that there was something going on. And, there's, in some ways, I wish I was able to mask better, because I ended up getting in trouble an awful lot because I could not keep my ish together. And so, I just censored myself there. Everyone give me thumbs up.
You were awesome. You were awesome. That was a very good way of pivoting toward it.
And so, but I think the other thing about masking, and Amanda was kind of alluding to this a little bit, but one of the huge things that I see, so I work primarily as a clinical mental health counselor right now, and I have families who come in and they're like, we can't get the school to give us any support because they don't see the problem.
see.
And then they come home and they are melting down from the minute they walk in the door. And they're so stressed out and so anxious because they are trained to do all these things that don't come as naturally to them. And that's why we need educators to understand this. That's why we need everybody to understand this. It's like we just need to know that we all have different personas. We all adjust how we act in various situations. That's fine. But we need to really be able to understand and adapt based on how that feels for us in certain environments. And in some environments, the benefits don't outweigh the drawbacks. And I should be able to be more authentic. It's like I'm sitting here, I'm in my little swivel chair. I'm trying not to swivel too much, but I'm going to a little bit. And that's just
swivel away,
and I'm
baby.
sitting here
swivel
with my
away.
and I'm sitting here with my fidget, right? Like we're doing sort of all the things.
And I'm fidgeting underneath the table.
See,
I'm fidgeting underneath the table. But partly, Emily and Amanda, because I was taught
to hide it.
right?
To hide
it's
it.
a habitual thing now. Like, I'm sure if someone were to, observe me for a day, they'd say, oh, you do certain things and why don't you do them more overtly? I'm not anti-stim. I'm all about stim. But I was taught to do certain things in a very covert way because we were of a certain generation and there weren't neuroaffirming schools. And so now it's a habit. It's like it would be so uncomfortable for me. I always fidget like underneath the table with my skirt, like down below where people can see underneath the desk, because that's what I did as a kid. And I'm happy, Emily, that you got diagnosed. Truthfully, like when I meet someone and they're like, I was diagnosed at 10, 12, 8, I'm like, hallelujah. Because that's still late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's still, and I think one of the things you're hitting on with the masking that we should talk about, just for those who are at home and they're like, everybody masks a little bit. For the everybody masks a little bit crowd, right? I mean, Amanda, I don't want to put you on the spot, but that suppression, what did it do to you?
I was the most anxious kid. I mean, I can't even tell you the amount of anxiety I carried, and I still carry as an adult, not as much anymore because I don't mask as much. I choose situations very carefully. I tell people who I am. I'm better about not caring. A little bit better about not caring, right? But I was a really anxious kid, and I went through bouts of what I now recognize as autistic burnout. I didn't know what it was. I just knew I was done, right? I had these moments where I just couldn't. As my kids who are in my kids who are in their 20s would say, like, you just couldn't even. Like, I just couldn't even any of the things, right? But I also I had a hard time keeping friends, right? Because I didn't have the energy to put back into those friendships, or when I did, I burnt people out pretty quickly, or because I had so much sort of intensity to me, right? It was a lot. And I struggle now with my own kids, all of whom are neurodivergent, right? To not put my own stuff on them and to let them be themselves, because I want to make sure, so I do a lot of tell me what that's like for you, instead of, oh, you must be, because I don't want to put that on them. But it took me years and years and years to realize that those things were ingrained because of who I couldn't be as opposed to who I am. And like, that's the piece that I want kids to understand, is they can be who they are and feel okay about that. And I want teachers to understand that that's what they're really supporting is kids feeling okay with who they are. And one of the things I do when I work with students is I talk to them about masking, right? And I think that's a conversation that we don't often have. And a lot of the kids I work with are like, I didn't even know I was doing that, or I didn't know I could do something different. And I love that I can have those conversations with them because, as Emily said, sometimes the benefits don't outweigh the drawbacks. And to be able to have those conversations with kids and say, what are the benefits and the drawbacks? What would it look like if you showed up differently? What would you like to show up? Who do you want to be in front of this particular person? Those are conversations that I wished I had had when I was younger, so I could feel much more comfortable in my own self.
Oh my God, so well said. So well said. Because, as I meet adults, because I've been doing this book for adults, so I've been, working with exclusively adults this year, basically, so that I could write the book and have all my little stories. And, I've always worked with adults, but just being with so many newly diagnosed adults, you talk about this in the book, and it is so true. So many people cannot tell you what they really like and dislike. And I will say, even though I definitely masked as a kid, I was always kind of a go against the system person. And I was always a little bit like, I like chocolate ice cream. No, I don't like vanilla. No, I'm not going to pretend I like vanilla, right? Like, which is what got me into trouble. But I really feel for some of these folks who are 40 years old and have no idea what they like, what they dislike, and they just are falling into people pleasing. And I think it's that history of, we want you to be this way, and so we've conditioned you, basically. I don't know, Emily, if you have thoughts about that.
Well, part of it is, especially when we talk about ADHD, one thing that many ADHDers begin to do is mask through perfectionism, because they get so much negative feedback about mistakes that they've made, errors that, things that they overlook in their work, or and so they become almost hyper vigilant about not making those mistakes because they get that negative feedback. But that is so stressful, it's
So
when
stressful.
you get into adulthood, and it impacts all areas of your life.
Yes.
When you can't allow that to just to let it go, this fear of making mistakes. And so that's a really easy one that I think a lot of older ADHDers have ingrained, that they don't even necessarily think of as masking, but it is. I mean, and not that you don't, there's a balance there, right? Like, nobody wants to make mistakes. Figure out the systems that work for you. But if you have like this almost like underlying low level trauma, hypervigilant response to the possibility of having something go out there, like that's something that we really want to let go of where and when we can. And I think that it impacts. I mean, we know there's so much of a health impact related to stress and anxiety. And when I think about masking, that's what always I think about, is like the level of stress that you have to experience to always be running this in this masking program in the background, of your brain.
Right. It's like an alternate being
Yeah.
that you're trying to, you have to be like, do I feel this way? Or just the other alternate being that I'm acting out feel this way?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had a client one time who told me, we were talking about eye contact specifically. And I was saying, I don't really notice that that's something that's difficult for you. You seem to manage eye contact okay. She just said, oh, no. Every time I'm looking at you, I'm thinking to myself, okay, make eye contact. Okay, now that's long enough. Okay, now look away. Okay, now look back. And so she's having to consciously think about that every time she's in a conversation. How can you be your best self if you're not able to be fully present because you're thinking that way?
Well, and I think there's something that you touched on that I think we should talk about too, which is there's almost a stereotype that ADHD folks can switch to this perfectionism and can become hypervigilant. And I'm here to tell you, and my husband would like totally co-sign this, I have the detail orientation of a newt. I do not see details. I am dyslexic, but I also do not see details. So one of the pushbacks I get that really fries my beans is that people will be like, why can't you do that? And I'm like, well, A, it's sick and it's not good for you and it's bad for your health. And see, I have no detail orientation. I am a big picture person. I am the person who comes up with, we should build the wall. And then someone else has to say, hey, Caroline, you need bricks, right? Like I do not see those little errors on a page. I do not see them. When I did math, you talked about their times tables. I don't see the errors. I am the queen of making those kind of little mistakes. Luckily, my husband is like a former financial analyst. And so he tends to be like Like just today, he told me you put the flights at like 4 o'clock in the morning instead of 4 in the afternoon. I'm like, oh, I'll change it. I'll change the calendar invite, right? But that's another thing. I get a lot of what I think is like kind of misogyny of like, why don't you do that thing that other people do? And I'm like, because it's not healthy.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amanda.
I was going to say, it's interesting. There's so many things that I'm thinking at the same time right now. Tell me I'm neurodivergent without telling me I'm neurodivergent by saying that out loud, right? But one of the things I'm thinking is when people say, why can't you do that? I always want to be like, why do you need me to, right? Which is a whole, like, that's a systems thing on my part too, right? To some degree, but why do you need me to? And then I was thinking about the calendar invite. Emily, I'm the calendar person for the two of us. Like literally, I'm the executive function calendar person. If we're going to have a meeting, it goes on the calendar and I'm the one putting it on there. Doesn't mean that Emily hasn't gotten like 3 revisions of that calendar because I'm like, oh, that was at 9 p.m. instead of 9 a.m. or I put it for 3 days instead of one, But in this real world that is not school, we can do that for each other. You can
Yes.
have somebody say to you, you need bricks for that wall, right? And you can say, can you pick out the bricks for me? In school systems, we do not often have the opportunity as students to say, I need to delegate this because this is not my strength, right? And so that's part of the masking component to me is asking kids to pretend they can do things that they're really not suited to do. And they try and they try and they try. And then we wonder why they can't do it because we haven't allowed them to say, this is hard for me.
Or they don't have the social skills or the social capital to get things done. Because I'm going to tell you, my kids asked me, how did you get through chemistry? And because I'm, the detail orientation being what it is. And I was like, oh, I had a lab partner. He wanted to go to parties. I wanted to pass chemistry. So I would have him help me with my lab reports, and then I would get him invited to parties. That was our deal. And my kids were like horrified. And I said, but think about that. You have to have, like, by then I had gained some sense of social capital. I had gained some sense of social skills, right? Which I had done by mimicking and mirroring and watching everybody. And so I was like, how can I get this cooked? I have no ability to do this chemistry. Like, it's never happening. So, but that requires confidence, a bit of sassiness. Like, kids can do stuff like that, but it takes like this sort of out of the box, a little bit audacious kid to do that. And some of these kids don't have the confidence to do that. And we also suppress it. And we switch their lab partner so they're no longer with that person. Whereas I was allowed to stay with this kid like all year. And you know what I mean? Like, there's just so many things that we want kids who despise each other to work together in a group nowadays. Why?
We want kids to work in a group when they would be better working on their own.
Exactly.
I mean, that's another place where we force kids to mask, and that's kind of a separate conversation. There's a time and a place. I think there's benefit to doing that in certain situations, but we get so caught up in like, you have to do it this way because it's the way it's always been done, without just reflecting and going, again, just like Amanda said, why does it have to be done that way? And is that really what's best for this person? And we don't give kids the voice to speak up and say, no, actually, I would be much better working in, say, a group of 2 instead of a group of 4, or working on my own, or whatever it might be. But when you look at like what's supposed to be happening in the school setting, you're often preventing them from reaching their potential when you're putting these artificial constraints on them that might be actually inhibiting their growth and whatever the goals might be of that class.